That's probably the hardest introduction actually I've ever gotten, but very nice. So what sidekick would I like? I'm about to spend just a little bit of time with her this week, Eva Longoria. So I'm not sure it's really a sidekick, but who wouldn't want to spend time with Eva Longoria? And then I think in terms of a social issue, I think I said the other day that, and a couple of times already, that one of my favorite quotes in the world is from a friend, Van Jones, who reminds us that Martin Luther King did not say, "I have an issue." He said, "I have a dream." And as a result, not my issue, but my dream is that we actually recognize our interwoven destinies, our connections together, and finally begin to heal some of the wounds that continue to divide us and to separate us and to prevent us from recognizing what is surely our common fate as we move forward. So let me get started then on first I really want to thank everybody for their hospitality. I want to thank Charlotte in particular, who has been gracious at every step along the way, and Trina and others. I want to thank Charlotte in particular for looking beautiful every day, which is kind of a wonderful thing to come to the office and see. And I also want to thank just Little Rock, Arkansas for having things like fried catfish. I mean, that's just really exciting, and I will be on the treadmill for about the next month trying to work off the food that is here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that I did and paper that I produced. Before I get started, I did say in other talks, that the other talk that I gave in the evening, that my voice might break a little bit. I actually have a speech disorder called spasmodic dysphonia, so it leads to a bit of a break or kind of tiring of the voice. Not to worry, it gets treated once a month with Botox, which is why I look so damn good. So it's, people from California, when they come to other states, usually the first thing they want to be sure to say is, "We're not moving here, don't worry," because people are worried about that frequently, particularly in places like Oregon and Washington. But I think it's also important to say, as someone from California, that trying to understand the South is something that we come to with great humility and with an understanding that the nuances of the South are difficult and difficult for others to understand. I wrote in the paper that a rose may be a rose, may be a rose, but the South is 1,000 different melodramas. And it's being played out to very different tunes in very different locales with very different nuances. And so someone who comes from the outside hears the twang of a particular banjo and hopes that they capture something about it. I hope that there's something that as I present to you humbly, you'll feel that you learned something from. I also want to say two other things to get started. I'm going to be focusing today on the issue of immigrant integration. I do not pretend to think that that is the most important issue facing the South, either in terms of economics or in terms of racial healing or in terms of social equity. But I know that it is an issue. And it's actually an issue that's particularly important in the South right now because of the rapidly changing demography for reasons I'll point out, and because of what you will actually look like in the future. You will not just be the South, you will be El Sur in a little while. And actually one of the interesting things is that while Arkansas has not really led the way in terms of the share immigrant, you've actually really led the way in terms of your Latin presence and your Mexican presence with data that you'll see in just a little while. One last little preface, which is that while I will talk about racial healing, I tend to think about racial healing as not simply conversations, but how it is that we change the structures of racial opportunity. I have a friend named David Ayon who once said he said a really great thing in a meeting, which was it was a meeting about race relations, and he reminded us of that movie, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? Some of the older folks here at least will remember that, right? Which is, it's about this young white woman who brings home a black doctor, and her parents, well, at least her dad, kind of freaks out. And you may recall that the black doctor is Sidney Poitier, right? And I've always said, man, if my son brought home Sidney Poitier, I'd be like, yo, that's just fine, okay? Sit down, Mr. Poitier, because, God, who wouldn't want Sidney Poitier in the family? But what David Ayon said about this is, you know, I don't really care whether I'm invited over your house for dinner. I want to own a house, right? So that one of the things that I think racial healing means is what is the change in our attitudes. But if you change the attitudes without changing the structures, you've simply made racial inequality have a nicer veneer. And so the issue of dealing with the structural issues is important as well. So why immigrant integration and why promote it in the South? I want to suggest to you that it's the right thing, it's the right time, and it helps put us, including the South, on the right track for the future. It's the right time to be doing this because actually there's a slowdown in the growth of the immigrant population to the United States. Many people think that it will be a continual and nonstop flow. That's certainly what's portrayed in popular media. But in fact, the immigration flows have slowed down in recent years. Net migration from Mexico is either zero or negative, and that's been the major pusher of the flow. And that's primarily because of changing demographic factors in Mexico, in particular the reduced fertility of Mexican women. And the fertility of Mexican women has fallen by about half in the last 25 years. So reduced immigration flows into the future, which means if you're not really dealing with immigration, you're dealing with immigrants. And you're dealing with the integration of immigrants who are already here. And this is particularly important because one of the things, I mean, I have a chart I won't show, but it used to be that, for example, 15% of Latinos in the United States in 1980 lived in Los Angeles County, where I live. I like to joke that I knew them all. But in fact, that's gone down to about 8%, and immigrants and Latinos are moving into unexpected areas. Within our metropolitan areas, they're moving into suburban locations, and often not through a process of spatial assimilation, going into the central city first and then moving out to the suburbs, but hopscotching directly out into the suburbs, landing there. That's particularly true of a place like Atlanta. But also, there's a lot of new locations, and one of those big new locations is the South. The South has been a place where lots of immigrants are coming, and then also, and you need to realize it's not just people who are immediately crossing the border and coming to the South, but it's people who are crossing the border, going to places like Los Angeles and saying, it's a little too urban, a little too tough, let me see where else I can go. And the South is a destination for people who've been here for just some number of years as well. And you can see what's happening if you look at a map of what we will call today the rest of the South. When we were trying to do the data analysis for this paper, and this is probably an unusual way for the visiting scholars, I think the visiting scholars usually are just the visiting scholars, but I have a center right at home. So I just kept telling them, make some maps, run some data, I want to find out. And one of the things that we did was we decided that when people think of the South, they often include Florida and Texas, but Florida and Texas have been traditional entry points for immigrants, so it kind of distorts the picture in ways that you'll see in a second. We also sort of lopped off Virginia. Those of you who maybe don't like the University of Virginia, you probably feel good about this. One of the reasons why we did that is that while Virginia was part of the original Confederacy, there's many ways in which Virginia, particularly with its high-tech sector, the nature of its immigrants, in fact, most of its immigrants are from El Salvador and India, et cetera, and the sort of suburban nature of its relationship to Washington, D.C., that it's not actually as much part of the South as it once was. So when we say the South, or really the rest of the South, we're including the Carolinas, moving over through Georgia, including Tennessee, Alabama, Louisiana, and of course Arkansas. So this is a map percent of the share of the population by census tract in that part of the South that was immigrant in 1980. This is what it looks like in 1990, in the year 2000, and then in the most recent census, right? So very dramatic increase in the percent of the population that's immigrants. So one of the reasons to be paying attention to this, of course, is that this is a really important set of new populations that have been arriving in the South. And you can see them in particular by looking at Arkansas. And this is, again, a breakdown for the percent immigrant by census tract in Arkansas in 1980. So that's 30 years ago. 32 years ago, then looking to the 2010 census, Arkansas, right? So big difference. I'll do that again because I heard a few oohs and ahs, and I really like it when people do that. So you can see it's just a real big spread, and including into your rural areas, not just your urban areas. And so this is a very different and new population. And so it's the right time because this is a population that you need to be grappling with as things move forward. It's the right thing for reasons people don't often think about. It's probably the right thing morally. It's the right thing morally to be a welcoming society and figure out how people can advance. But it's also the right thing because increasingly what research demonstrates, and this is a chart showing it, is that those areas that have more dynamic growth have also fast-growing shares of the foreign-born. And it is not simply that fast growth is attracting the foreign-born, because fast growth should attract the U.S.-born too. The fact that the share is going up over time speaks to the fact that immigrants in general have higher rates of labor force attachment, have higher rates of entrepreneurship, help to revitalize cities, and are essentially propelling economies forward. So we find the most vital economies to be ones that have lots of immigrants. And interestingly, they tend to have both high-skill and low-skill immigrants. So, for example, in the Silicon Valley in California, where I come from, we certainly have our share of very high-skill, mostly Asian immigrants. But here's an interesting secret. Almost every high-tech place in the United States also has a very large and increasing share of low-skill, often undocumented immigrants. Why? Because behind every software engineer is an army of nannies and gardeners and people who take care of their houses, and the high-skill and low-skill labor clump together and drive the economy forward. So people are also saying, gosh, we should reform immigration so we only get high-skill immigrants, right? But it really doesn't work because high-skill immigrants and high-skill native-born rely on low-skill workers that clump around them as well. So it's the right thing to do because of the economic contributions and how to move the metro areas forward, and it's about getting us on the right track. Certainly in California we know this already, but you may be surprised to know that 13% of U.S. residents are immigrants. Almost half of those are citizens, right? They've gone through the naturalization process, so they're definitively here to stay. And nearly 1/4 of the children in the United States have at least one immigrant parent. In places like California, 50% of the children have at least one immigrant parent. So how those kids do, but moreover how their parents do, will determine what we wind up looking like in the country as we move forward over time. So getting us on the right track means that immigrant integration is an important area. So what does the paper do? The paper, which was just completed this morning at about 9 o'clock, is just really excellent. And I'm sure it will be one of the stellar contributions in the series that you've had. And I believe that it will be soon made into a major motion picture as well. So I will not be ceding the movie rights to Charlotte, although I know she's pretty excited about that. What we try to do is to offer a demographic overview of the demographic change in the South, to highlight some examples of best practices of community building at the intersection of racial healing, social equity, and immigrant integration, and then make some recommendations for community philanthropy in the form of a top 10 list, because everybody likes David Letterman. So first we can look at what's going on for the U.S. Demographics from 1970 rolling forward into 2050, and I talked about this in the first night here. By the year 2042, the U.S. will be a so-called majority-minority nation. By the year 2019, 2020, somewhere in there, the majority of youth, folks under the age of 18, will be people of color. And last year, in the United States as a whole, was the first year that the majority of births were to people of color. And when people hear those statistics, they often think, well, that must be happening somewhere else, right? Certainly not in my neighborhood, certainly not in my part of the United States. So that's what the U.S. looks like from 1970 to 1950. For the sub-regions of the United States, we're able to do from 1980 to 2040. We've been working with a group called PolicyLink on developing both good data for the past and then projections rolling forward on what America will look like for every county in the United States, but these can be aggregated up to the state level too. So this is, when you think about the South, this is what Florida looks like. Florida is already, well, Florida will be by about 2030, majority people of color. One thing to notice about Florida, which is kind of interesting, is that it's a sort of slightly growing share projected of the African American population. Much of the change is coming from the Latino population rolling forward. And when you think of Florida, who are those Latinos? What are they? Cubans, and that's wrong. Right? Because what's happened is that while the Cubans were the early part of it, they're an older population, they're not having as many kids. In fact, even in the city of Miami, Cubans are now less than half of the Latino population. So it's a bunch of other Latinos moving in as well. In the northern part of Florida, it's a lot of Puerto Ricans, but it's a lot of other folks from Latin America as well. So that's actually a more diverse change than people think, but that's what Florida looks like. This is what Texas looks like. Texas, very dramatic. It's going to have a slight shrinkage in its African American population, continue with the trend that's been happening since the 1980s. Big growth in the Latino population. In fact, Texas is already majority minority and has been probably since about 2003, 2004, which makes you wonder how they can elect so many white legislators. It's a thing we call redistricting, or gerrymandering. So significant lack of sort of political representation there. But one of the things to notice about Florida and Texas is that when people think of the big demographic change going on in the South, that's, often what they think is driving it. So what we tried to do is to take a look at first the South as a whole. Oh, this is the South excluding Florida and Texas, so it's all those other places, the rest of the South that I was talking about, which is kind of basically the deep South plus Arkansas and Tennessee. And, I don't know whether you consider yourselves deep. Having been here for a week, at least I consider you profound. So just a real spirit in Arkansas, which, it's very deep. But looking at the rest of those states, one of the things to notice is that the African American share will really stay pretty stable over time. You're going to be seeing a significant growth in the Latino population, and by the year 2040, the white population will be about 54%, meaning that a little bit later than the rest of the country, but not too far behind, the South will be a majority minority area as well. And this set of immigrants are arriving on a terrain that's been largely kind of forged by black-white relations and a very different kind of racial politics, but it does suggest something that may be going on, which are some of the ties that are being built in certain locations, in particular between African Americans and Latinos, and I'll get to that in a minute. This is Arkansas's changing demographics. You're sort of lagging the rest of the South that I was talking about. Smaller share of the African American population. You're projected to have a pretty sizable increase in the Latino population. By the year 2040, the African American and Latino populations will be in rough parity and comprise a bit more than a quarter of the population. Now this shows you for this part of the South the demographic change. By the way, is this interesting? You find this cool? Good. Okay. This shows you the demographic change for percent black. 1980 will go to 2010 in a second, and you can see areas that were significantly African American. And then you can see that in 2010, that sort of thinned out a little bit. For Latinos in 1980, nary a brown spot on the map, right? And therefore a real shortage of taquerias, which by the year 2010 has changed dramatically, right? Sort of Latino populations all over the South, and obviously restaurants, churches, and other things that go along with that. One of the things to notice about the rest of the South, and this kind of gets, this is a chart on the recency of migration, so it's whether people arrived in the country in the year 2000 or later, The second band is they arrived in the 1990s. The red band is they arrived in the 1980s. And the gray band is sort of long-term immigrants, people who've been here a very long time. So if you're looking at that chart, what you'll notice is that the rest of the South, right, that band of 8 states, right, basically has a lot more recent immigrants, right? Its immigrants, the share of its immigrants are much more from a recent vintage than from earlier eras. And that means people who may speak less English, people who may be less accustomed to what U.S. life is all about, and certainly less accustomed to the racial politics and racial etiquette of the South. And you'll also see that something dramatically changed, and then we'll move past these demographics in a minute. Something dramatically changed in terms of the country of origin. So in 1980, for the United States South, which is just those 8 southern states I'm talking about, you'll see that 16% of people who were immigrants, foreign-born at that time, just said they were born abroad. In fact, they didn't really identify a country. The country behind that was West Germany, then Canada, then England, then Vietnam, then Japan. But you can see as you start moving to Korea, Philippines, Cuba, etc., you're really moving down into sections of the population that's sort of 2% and stuff like that, right? So one thing you'll notice there is a big absence of what group? Mexicans, right? So this is the 2010. 1/3 of the immigrants are from Mexico, followed by India, Vietnam, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. In the Mexican population, you can see that in Arkansas. Nary a Mexican in your top 10 list. And in 1980, and again, 15%, I think, identifying themselves as just being from abroad. When you get to Arkansas in the year 2010, 49% of your immigrants hail from Mexico. In fact, you are the most Mexican in terms of the composition of your immigrant population of the 8 southern states. So, I don't know how to say Arkansas in Spanish, but someone must. So, I guess Arkenbio. So anyway, so very interesting that it's a very dominantly Mexican population. So let me say a couple of words then about the tensions that this induces and then the best practices that people are using to deal with this in the South and elsewhere, and then a little bit about what community philanthropy can do. So we've tended to take a look at the economic and social tensions between African Americans and immigrants, and people look at this all over the country. And the basic summary of the research is as follows, including research we've done on labor markets in California, and then I'm going to differentiate it for the South. Economists from the right and the left, from the Cato Institute and, you know, the most left institution you can think of, from really neoclassical to really radical economists, all agree that immigrants bring a net benefit to the U.S. economy. When immigrants come, they have 2 effects. One is a substitution effect, sort of taking a job that maybe somebody else had, but it's also a complementary effect, right? So when immigrants pick crops, that helps farmers, that helps truckers who move the crops, that helps grocery stores and grocery store workers, etc. When you have garment workers for example, in Los Angeles, that's helped to keep the fashion industry in LA. And by keeping the fashion industry in LA, we've got high-end designers, we've got truckers, we've got warehousing, much better jobs, right? And it turns out that all that complementary effect dominates the substitution effect, right? But there is a substitution effect, and so some people win and some people lose, right? But the whole economy is expanding. So the issue is who wins and who loses, and of course most folks immediately think it must be African American workers who are relatively low skilled, lacking a high school degree. And it turns out that essentially countrywide and in a place like California with a very mature immigrant population, that's basically not true. And it's basically not true because the people who immigrants displace are other immigrants and U.S. born Latinos. And I said the other night that it's interesting when you look at the economic effects, the people who benefit the most from immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, are whites in the United States. The people who get hurt the most from undocumented immigrants are U.S.-born Latinos. The people who kind of are in the middle are African Americans. The people who complain the most about immigration are U.S.-born whites. The people who are the most welcoming of immigration are U.S.-born Latinos. The people who are kind of in the middle are African Americans, suggesting that African Americans are the only rational political actors in the United States. Part of the reason why I voted for Obama the last time. So the interesting thing here is that while that is true economy-wide, and while that is true in places like California, in places like the South, there aren't pre-existing immigrants or U.S.-born Latinos to displace. So the displacement effects here are real, are felt, are authentic, and they create tensions. So even if you're expanding the economy and there can be some jobs, there's some real displacement effects that people need to talk about and really need to deal with. And the other thing that's going on is that, that's what this is that if the other thing that's going on is that this arrival of immigrants is occurring in a situation in which two lacks of knowledge exist. One is a lack of knowledge on the part of immigrants, particularly who are recently arrived, et cetera, of the sort of African American struggle for civil rights and social justice in the South. And sort of lacking that knowledge, not being able to interpret correctly why African Americans have been at the bottom of the labor market, not being able to figure out effectively how to form alliances. And a similar lack of knowledge on the part of African Americans about where folks are coming from, what their histories are, what the sort of resemblance of that is to some stuff African Americans have gone through, particularly the Great Migration northward. How many of you have read the book Warmth of Other Suns? So really great book, and that book actually loops back frequently to talk about the relationship of the Great Migration to the current migration. But without that lack of, with that economic competition, without that lack of base knowledge, you do have a recipe for conflict. So the question is, can we all get along? And it's important to realize that if racism is about prejudice and power, not just attitude, but the ability to do something about it, then racial healing has to be about changes in attitudes, but also changes in structures. I mean, you've got sharp inequalities here. For example, in Arkansas, this is showing you the percent of families living below the federal poverty line, or 150% of the federal poverty line, 1980, and then in the 2008 through 2010 period. You can see here both very sharp disparities between whites, African Americans, and Latinos, but you can also see that for Latinos, that poverty rate's actually gone up. These are the high school dropout rates by race and ethnicity, and you can see also sharp differentials, particularly for Latinos, and the educational attainment of adults right here in the Little Rock Metro, where you've got higher high school dropout rates for African Americans, super high lack of completion of high school for Latinos, and you will wind up getting racial inequality reproduced over time. So there's a whole set of policies that one needs to talk about, but in lifting up the best practices, what I tried to do in the paper is to understand that fighting for concrete change means trying to improve people's lives in a concrete way, but it also means trying to find ways to connect communities in authentic and transformational ways. Authentic meaning the following. It's very easy to say that you've had a really good racial healing conversation when you bring together the leaders of organizations who are very polite with one another, right, and who are able to, you know, they have a conversation and it's in a university and people are very polite and it's really nice, and that's called racial healing, right? Like, I don't think so, right? So I'm going to tell you, and I'm sorry I told the students this experience, but this is a great experience. When I first got back into Los Angeles, after being away for about 10 years working in Northern California, I was asked, it was 2007, to help host a community meeting in South LA with African American and Latino residents on black-brown issues and how people could come together on an economic strategy for the future. And my co-speaker was a woman named Karen Bass, who was the first African American female leader of a state assembly, at that time leader of the state assembly in California. And she and I got up and we talked and about the, you know, demographic changes in South LA, the deindustrialization that had gone on, the loss of black employment, that happening just as the crack trade took off and gangs got militarized and immigrants were coming in from Central America. And so trying to put this all in a context where people could find their common base, right? And wasn't quite the first question out, but like I think maybe the second or third question we got all done. It was kind of a nice conversation. Somebody raised their hand and said, a young African-American man said, you know, I used to like Mexicans. I just don't like these new Mexicans, right? And then afterwards, actually an older African-American guy got up and raised his hand and said, you know, the issue is these young black guys don't want to work, right? And that's the reason why these immigrants are here, right? Now, that was a real conversation, right? And that real conversation, which was bumpy, full of tensions, full of truths, led to people deciding at the end that they needed to work together. And they wound up working together on campaigning for a retrofit ordinance in the city of Los Angeles to retrofit buildings, to deal with, to green them, to deal with climate change, and to build in apprenticeship programs for young African American and Latino youth to come through the construction industry to be part of the retrofitting of those buildings. But they started with a healing conversation that was not polite. It was real, and it led to some real and authentic healing. So what are the communities that are trying to do this? Here in the South, I mean, there's examples from all over the country, but here in the South, you've got the Mississippi Immigrant Rights Alliance, which has been doing long-term relationship building for social justice. And part of this is actually a very conscious strategy that's brought African Americans into the fold. And the reason is, excuse me, that Mississippi is the blackest state in the United States, but it is not projected to become majority black anytime in the future. However, it could be majority people of color, right? And so you've got a lot of, I mean, you've had 200 pieces of anti-immigrant legislation in the state essentially beaten back by the Black Caucus. The Mississippi NAACP and the Mississippi Immigrant Rights Alliance, which does a lot of grassroots organizing, has been an important part of that. People are recognizing their self-interest, but they're also doing the kind of relationship building that gets them to recognize their humanity. Similarly, in New Orleans, the wake of the storm also brought a flood of immigrants. And the immigrants came to do some of the construction work that was there. It created a lot of resentments with African Americans who'd been displaced and were wondering about the work that was due them. There's something called the New Orleans Worker Center for Racial Justice, which has taken upon itself the task of organizing both these immigrant laborers and African American day laborers who also want to be part of the construction, and also African Americans who are trying to get the funds to rebuild their homes, right? And by doing that, they're able to kind of bring people together through authentic conversations and through self-interest. Similarly, the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, which has actually been doing much more work with bringing whites and immigrants together around simply the issue of protecting immigrants. And they've actually kind of morphed into something called Welcoming America, which is trying to build one-on-one relationships between long-timers and newcomers using a variety of different vehicles to try to, including dinners that bring people together from different communities, etc. And I want to show you a video of some of their work.
My name is Kasia Różecka. I'm from Poland.
My name is Ismael Ruiz Millan and I am from Mexico.
In Iran, there is no freedom for speech.
My name is Sima Fallahi.
My dad grew up in India. My mom was born in Japan. My name is Salim, and my family has lived in North Carolina for almost 20 years.
I feel so hip for going multimedia on you. So anyway, what Welcoming America does is a bunch of things of trying to get people to connect one-on-one and individually with the stories of immigrants, right? Bringing church congregations together, doing the kind of bringing people together on a one-on-one basis so that they can see that sort of humanity in each other. So coming from this work, what are the recommendations for community philanthropy? Charlotte, please take these down and do them. You know, I tried to kind of come up with a top 10 list, and I want to go through them very, very quickly, and then I'll just close with what I think this means for leadership. So the first is to support welcoming initiatives that engage longtime residents in exactly this kind of work that's in the video. I mean, being part of that, right, is then becoming open and kind of understanding who is there and who is not. There is a Welcoming America, which has now branches all over the country. It came out of the Tennessee experience, and it's something to be paying attention to. The second is to encourage civic engagement by immigrants. And in encouraging civic engagement by immigrants, it means thinking not just about promoting naturalization, which is very important, but also promoting English as a second language classes so that people can participate civically and economically, and also thinking about venues where people can participate, such as parent engagement at schools. And I think that's a really important thing as well, and I'll loop back to that at the end. The third is to make particular investments in black immigrant coalition building. This is a place where there's a lot of friction and tension. It's a place where there's a lot of ability for communities to learn from one another, and there's no way that immigrants can make progress in the United States if one of the main anchors for the social justice movements in the United States, the African American population, is not also making progress at the same time. That's not the kind of America people would want to live in or come to anyway. So we need to be making a lot of investments in that kind of coalition building. We need to invest in grassroots organizing and community building, because it's that grassroots efforts, those kind of uncomfortable conversations I was talking about, that actually lead to a deeper understanding. And a lot of that is about base community building. We need to promote the right economic story. It's striking to me, the story that we tell about scarcity versus the story we tell about contributions and potential abundance and how working together we can produce more. The zero-sum story dominates, and it tends to make people fearful, and the zero-sum story has not that much support within economics, and we need to think about the factors that are driving that story to have support. We need to promote ties with business. One of the coolest and most interesting things that happened over the last year was something called, last 2 years, was something called the Utah Compact. The Utah Compact was an agreement amongst civic leaders, business leaders, immigrant leaders, and religious leaders, and there really was just 5 principles for a civil conversation around immigration. I mean, someone can say they don't think more immigrants should be coming to the country without dehumanizing undocumented people as though they're not actually people. Someone can talk about the difficulties of regulating these issues and what would be a proper guest worker program without opening the way for exploitation. I mean, I know I write about this stuff, and I've actually had to coach my African American co-authors, because I say, I know you've seen racist stuff written after you post something on the web. Wait till you see what's coming up when we talk about immigrants, right? I mean, people just jump on and they write things like, instead of Latinos, Ratinos. You know, they really don't think these immigrants are human beings, right? So the Utah Compact promoted a very civil conversation about which there can be many different policy positions, and very significantly they incorporated the Salt Lake City Chamber of Commerce. And we, for example, in Los Angeles have been running something called the Council for Immigrant Integration, and one of the main players in it is the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce. And 2 years ago, when the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce went to the Congress with 3 items that they were lobbying for on their business lobby day, I forget what the other 2 were, but one of them was the DREAM Act. Lobbying for the DREAM Act, understanding from a business point of view that if you've made all this public investment in high school and elementary school and the university for these kids, we better make sure that they work, right, so that they can actually contribute. Besides, if you've actually met them, they're as American and perhaps more American than so many of us. Now, no academic could have a recommendation without saying fund additional research. Now, I think that that's not just self-serving. I think it is important to have research scaffold for the stories that we tell and for people to know what the facts are. One thing that you might think of in particular is developing an immigrant integration scorecard. We've developed one for California, ranking our 10 different regions by how well they're doing at integrating immigrants. And by actually making that a positive thing, you're seeing people go, wait a minute, I got kind of a low score. What can I do to bring it up, right? Because they're recognizing that immigrant integration may actually be positive for their economic health. Ninth, for community philanthropy, is to act as a civic leader. There's a power in giving, but there's also a power in convening. And community philanthropy in general, community philanthropy in particular, has that kind of authority to call on unusual actors to come together, to bring the business community together with the immigrant community, to bring the African American civil rights community together with immigrant leaders, to think about these welcoming initiatives. If you think of philanthropy just in terms of resources around giving, you're forgetting about the resources of civic leadership and authority. The 10th is to insist to national philanthropy that the South is the future. I know that you feel neglected by national philanthropists, and you are. But I do think that thinking through this demography and saying, look, what's going on is all this stuff around immigrant integration. It can be coupled with our coexisting work on racial healing and social equity, and this is where everything is going to be either gotten really right or gotten really wrong, where we can learn from other people's mistakes and forge something new and pass around best practices. I think making that case to national philanthropy so that investments occur here is part of the role for civic and community leadership. So let me just close. I'll leave that up here, but I'm going to close actually with a story, because stories are good to close with, right? And it wasn't the story I was thinking about closing with, so I don't have a slide for it. But there's just something, of course, so great about authentic community leadership emerging and people really speaking their minds and being able to really express their community's needs and move things forward. And I was reminded of this before I moved from Santa Cruz to Los Angeles. On one of the last nights I was there, a community organizing group which had been able to build ties between churches and synagogues, and the churches included Protestant churches and Catholic churches with a significant immigrant presence, convened a meeting in a place called Live Oak in Santa Cruz, and people got up to speak. And they got up to speak and they asked for three things. They asked for the County Board of Supervisors to put more money into a community center, and a member of the Board of Supervisors got up and agreed that he would do that. They asked the adult ESL classes to double the number of ESL classes, and the adult learning program agreed to do that, and on the spot they brought out sheets and they were able to basically fill all those doubled classes that night. And they also had the head of the community college there, and they asked him to agree to create a permanent partnership with the middle schools in this neighborhood to create a path for the students to go to this really great community college. And so many people got up to speak, but one of the persons who got up to speak that I was so proud of was this immigrant Latino fellow. He's about 45 years old. And he got up and spoke, a little nervous, but he got up and spoke in English about the needs of the community. And this was a guy who owned a business in the community. It was a roofing business, who had actually been, and those of you who have had kids understand what a miracle this is. He was president of the PTA at my school, right? So like a dude, right, was president of the PTA, right? So, the PTA met at night, he would come, right? He was president for like a couple of years. And his daughter was one of the highest achieving Latina students in the high school in Santa Cruz, nearly the class valedictorian. And it felt like such a night of democratic participation to see this immigrant Latino step up and participate fully in the civic life of Santa Cruz, California, and with his role as a PTA president and his daughter as such a leader. And I went home in the chill air thinking, how great America was and what a great thing grassroots democracy was. And that evening, Immigration and Customs Enforcement picked up this man and his wife and deported them. They had come into the country without papers, and they had decided that after 10 or 15 years of building a life there, of having their kids be born and grow up there, of building a business there, of buying a home, that they wanted to try to take a path toward legalization. And they hired a lawyer, and by hiring the lawyer, they wound up making an application for having their status adjusted. And because the paperwork wasn't perfect, they got picked up and deported, stranding their 4 kids with this high school girl in charge of the other 3 kids, and trying to figure out, and the whole community did scramble around to try to figure out how to protect this family, but to this day that family remains divided. That is not the kind of America I want to live in, is the kind of America I experienced on that chill night, where everybody had a chance to be a part, everybody had a chance to speak, everybody had a chance to contribute. The kind of America I don't want to be part of is the kind of America that takes someone who is truly a citizen, who in every way has participated fully in our civic life, contributed economically to job creation, bought a house, produced a high-achieving family, where that kind of a person is thought to not be welcome. That is not the kind of America I want to live in. And to me, the issues of racial healing, social equity, and immigrant integration are not separate rivers. They're all part, they're not separate streams. They're all part of one big river to a better and more inclusive America, one where social justice issues are lifted up, one where all of our dreams are made real. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pastor. We do have time for a couple of questions. Ruth?
Thank you so much. We're so glad you're here. We actually have a committee that grew out of the Chamber of Commerce's strategic plan, and it's a task force called Better Together, and it's to work on these very things. And I just want to ask you your advice, because at one point I brought the Welcoming America materials to the meeting thinking maybe this is the direction, or now I'm excited to look at the Utah Compact, that sort of thing. But one of our committee members said, I'm kind of afraid to do this sort of thing, to kind of start this sort of thing, because will that only stir up the anti-immigrant feelings that are already there and under the surface, and, you know, all of those myths that we're dealing with. And I think that's a concern. And so I would like your thoughts or your advice about that.
So really glad to hear that the Chamber's involved. I think that brings a particular authoritative voice, and for anybody who's sort of an immigrant rights activist in the room, you're really missing an opportunity if you don't get to the Chamber, because the Chambers understand the economic contribution, the economic argument, et cetera. So, you know, just because you don't bring it up doesn't mean it's not there, right? So, you know, I wrote this book with Angela Glover Blackwell and Stuart Quill called Uncommon Common Ground. Charlotte was promising that she was going to buy copies for all of you, and I don't know what happened. But anyway, she did make sure that she got copies for all the students here at the Clinton School, which is great. But one of the things we say in that book is that it's important to get race up front, to get race behind. And what my experience has been is that the thing I was talking about, that community meeting, like I never heard black-brown issues come up after that meeting. Essentially what happened was people kind of were able to kind of get some of that stuff out of their system and figure out where to move forward, right? And I think that it's really useful to have these conversations. They have to be well facilitated, and they have to be done in a spirit, and I, you know, again, for those of you who are on Tuesday night, pardon me for saying this again, but they have to be done in a spirit in which people can make mistakes with one another, right? Where you are allowed to sort of say something stupid while people figure out how to learn from one another, right? Like, isn't everybody from Latin America Mexican? I mean, you know, it's not the most informed question, but, you know, I'd love to have it asked and help to explain what the differences are, right? And, you know, you have to create a space where people can ask kind of stupid things of one another on the way to doing it. So my recommendation is to go forward, to do it one-on-one, and I will say one thing, to tailor it specifically in a way that fits the audience. So it might be very good to figure out some Latino small business people, right, who might be the first starting point for this conversation, because what people will have in common is the difficulties of running a business, how do you deal with the regulators, blah, 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 blah. Really interesting thing going on in LA right now. It's been a huge transformation in South LA, particularly in South Central, where it's gone, like right along Central Avenue, it's gone to being about 90% Latino. It used to be 90% African American. However, the business association is headed by an African American woman, although almost all of the members are Latino. And the reason is she's been a business person for a long time. She knows what she's doing. Everybody loves her, right? And she helps explain the system to them. And they've also did things like during the 1992 civil unrest when everything was burning. It was the Latinos in the neighborhood who saved her store, right? So they're building these ties, but it's around really specific things. So I don't think bringing together completely disparate people, but I think starting with maybe business people or people who have that mindset might be a good way to go. Hope that's helpful.
Anyone else? Well, Dr. Pastor, thank you so much for the visit to Arkansas.